Thank you for joining the Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. I'm Rosalind Martin, your host, a voice actor and mom of a young adult with Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. This podcast is dedicated to enlightening, nourishing, and uplifting Black parents of adult children with ASD. Managing the daily responsibilities that come with the ASD diagnosis are challenging enough on their own. Layer on issues of racial discrimination, systemic injustices in the legal system, healthcare disparities, and more, and the journey becomes even more daunting. Too often, we as Black parents of adults with ASD feel overlooked and adrift in life's complexities. We either don't have the same supports and networks we had when our children were younger, or we never had them at all. We crave moments of recognition where we can feel acknowledged, heard, and truly understood. The Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast serves as a sanctuary of connection, community, and camaraderie where no explanations are necessary. Why? Because we all just get it. During our time together, I'll share insights into ASD, engage experts on various topics, and offer moments of solace and laughter to hopefully help soothe your spirits. Join me so we can navigate this journey together. Welcome to the Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. I'm your host, Rosalind Martin. My guest during this episode will be Dr. Toi Curry, a clinical neuropsychologist who conducts Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, testing in adults. She and I will be discussing ASD, where the question is to formally test for ASD or not. And she'll help parents sort out options and provide some considerations. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, ASD refers to a broad range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech, and nonverbal communication. Some people wonder why autism is referred to as a spectrum disorder. Well, it's because there's a wide variation in the type and severity of symptoms that people experience. You see, no two people with autism are affected in the same way. The CDC estimates that about 1 in 36 children and about 1 in 45 adults in the U.S. have ASD. While we know that Black children are typically diagnosed with autism later than white children, some Black children make it well into adulthood without ever having been officially evaluated or tested for autism. That said, some Black parents in our community may have delayed or avoided ASD evaluation and testing altogether for reasons which may include the fact that they were in denial, maybe suspecting that their loved one had some challenges, but decided to dismiss them, thinking that they would somehow grow out of their seemingly difficult, bad, or odd behavior. Some maybe allowed friends or family members to talk them out of it because, there's nothing wrong with them. They just need a spanking. My son is 22 years old and on the spectrum. And I tell you, if I had $1 for every time somebody said that to me, I'd be a zillionaire, but I digress. Some maybe wanted to avoid feeling a sense of shame if their child received an ASD diagnosis. For some, the diagnosis in and of itself would have been really hard to grapple with. I remember feeling that when my son was diagnosed. There's that sense of paralyzing fear of what will the days ahead bring? For those parents who had boys, maybe another reason testing may have been delayed or avoided was that they heard boys mature much slower than girls. Don't worry about testing, he'll catch up. There could be so many other reasons. But to this end, I have personally been approached by some parents in our community whose loved ones have just entered adulthood or are well into adulthood, and they've never been evaluated for ASD. And now they want them to be tested, but they have no idea where to start. They're struggling with the decision of whether they should have them tested at all. And they also feel this sense of guilt that they didn't do it sooner. And the first thing I say to them is please don't continue to carry any sense of guilt for not having them tested. At this point, let's focus on the here and now, and let's figure out how you can best support your adult child in this moment. I also want to note that there may be some individuals in our community who are listening and they may be higher functioning, and they may suspect that they have ASD and they wish to advocate for themselves and pursue testing, and that's great. Hopefully this information will help you too. So now the question becomes, do you formally test your adult child or not for ASD? And either way, what are your options? Before we dive into the discussion, please know that there are no medical tests for ASD. So this means that ASD cannot be detected using methods like blood tests or imaging tests. Welcome to the Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. I'm your host, Rosalind Martin. And if you're just tuning in, we are discussing ASD, where the question is to formally test for ASD or not to test. As promised, joining me to discuss ASD evaluation and testing options is Dr. Toi Curry, clinical neuropsychologist who conducts ASD testing in adults. Dr. Curry, thank you for joining me on the Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is such a critical topic, and it's great to have the opportunity to get this information out to a broader audience.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Curry, as you've been listening, we're speaking to those Black parents whose adult children have never been tested for ASD. And what we want to do is help them explore obtaining an ASD diagnosis through a couple of scenarios, offering these parents some guidance and considerations to help them better determine which option may work best.
Absolutely.
So, as mentioned, we'll approach this discussion using a couple of scenarios, with the first scenario being maybe some parents feel they don't want their adult child to undergo any sort of formal ASD evaluation and testing. They're essentially looking for alternatives to official evaluation and testing, perhaps where the goal is to, let's say, achieve self-awareness, maybe get a baseline based on any signs and symptoms observed, etc. To that end, can we please start with you telling us your thoughts about these online checklists and self-evaluations out there? They're plentiful. There's certainly no shortage of them on the internet. Can you please tell us whether these tools are sufficient? Maybe discuss the validity of these tools.
So, there are pros and cons to using online tools and checklists, especially if your goal is helping yourself or your child kind of develop just some self-awareness and really getting a sense of what's this box, right? Like we as a society, like putting things in pretty little boxes. We don't necessarily love the label, but we love the box because it makes us feel like we are seen and heard and understood. And so, you know, there are many checklists that go through the symptoms of, you know, autism spectrum disorders. And as you mentioned earlier, once you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. So different people are going to present very differently and may still fall under that category of autism spectrum disorder. I would say, you know, if we're talking about adults, parents should really be leaning on, and individuals themselves, very reliable sources. So checklists that they're going to find on websites like cdc.gov, right? That Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website is a national organization who is really dedicated to really strong scientifically based research and a lot of information for the community on a variety of conditions, autism spectrum disorders being one of them. Another legitimate organization is Autism Speaks. They've got a long history of really doing a lot to work with families, to work with communities, and to work and educate professionals on just all matters autism. And so I would say those would be my top two kind of web-based places to search for checklists. And, you know, links that they send you to, they've typically vetted, particularly the CDC. And so those are checklists that I would say are relatively valid. I love TikTok, but I will tell you that there are a lot of faux professionals on TikTok. And so, you know, checklists or, you know, those put your fingers up if, right? If you have sensory issues, if it was hard making friends, if you probably have an autism spectrum disorder, right? You could have a lot of things going on. You know, you could be a quirky kid. You could be a blurred, which is a massive community of just Black nerds, right? So there's a lot of different things that could be happening.
Excellent point.
So I would, I'd really veer away from kind of social media based surveys, rating scales, checklists, things like that, and really stick to those that are research-based, which are more likely to find, again, at websites like cdc.gov or Autism Speaks. The other piece of that, though, is autism spectrum disorders are made up of a series of symptoms, right? And so if you think of it like, I like to think of it like a burrito, right? So if you got these, your symptoms are like, I like ground beef burritos, sometimes chicken, but I'm a ground beef lady. So, you've got your ground beef might be your social difficulties, and your lettuce might be some language issues, and you've got some cheese, right? I like shredded cheese, not queso. My shredded cheese might be some of the language difficulties, right? And so I've got all these, the tomatoes, and that pico is some of the attentional dysfunction. I've got all these symptoms or components that sometimes when they all go together, it's an autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes though, it's a burrito, right? That burrito is an autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes you've got all those symptoms and it's more of an ADHD taco salad, right? Sometimes you've got that and it's, well, there's ground beef, there's cheese, there's pico, there's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. That's more of a cheeseburger that's related to social anxiety disorder. So just because the checklist says you have all of these symptoms, the context is critical. How that plays out for you is critical. And so it could be an autism spectrum disorder. It could be ADHD. It could be social anxiety. It could be generalized anxiety. There are a lot of things that can be going on. I think when we're talking about, for the sake of self-awareness, I like to think about it, again, we like these boxes, but I like to think about it less about the box and the label and more about functional needs and supports. So regardless of whether I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? So something like an ADHD or social anxiety, I get anxious. And so what am I going to do to support myself in situations where I know I might be anxious? For some people, and when we talk about, other scenarios where there's a more formal diagnosis, that intervention involves medication. That medication requires a formal diagnosis. But if the goal is really, I just want to know why I do this. Why do I make plans with my friends and then at the last minute decide I'm not going to go? Why do I blurt out the weirdest thing in the room in the loudest voice at the most inopportune time, right? Let's go through those checklists, figure out, I'm marking all of these language-based, social language-based things. Maybe that's something I can work on. Here are some activities, strategies, tips. Here's what I can help people to understand about me, regardless of a diagnosis or a label. And so I would say utilizing checklists is great, but utilize them to figure out, what are my functional needs? Where are my areas of growth? And we should all be doing that, right? We should all be looking at ourselves and trying to analyze and be more aware of like where we need to grow and what can we do to get there. So I hope that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Excellent points. I love the burrito analogy for several reasons. And I think it's such a great point to make because we don't always consider that. I was thinking back to, when my son was probably, I don't know, first or second grade, and his teacher was saying, he's struggling with focusing during the day and not getting through his assignments and all of this. And I'm going, well, he has autism. Hello. And so it got progressively worse, such that I had to circle back with his pediatrician. And she says, well, Rosalind, it's he could have ADHD and ADD. And I'm going, what are those even? Because we're talking 20 years ago, right? And we had not advanced as much as we have now in terms of information and all of that. And so she says, he could have ASD, ADD, ADHD. And I'm like, okay, and should we throw in LMNOP and XYZ? It was like a veritable alphabet soup, right? Yep. As if ASD weren't enough. You add those two to the mix and you've got these comorbidities or these two or more existing or three or more existing conditions that you have to manage. And it's important that parents understand that, it's not uncommon to have to deal with these, underlying conditions. So I really think that's important too. Yeah, when you're going through these checklists and self-evaluations, that those are excellent considerations.
Absolutely. I think you also made a really great point early on when you were talking about, sometimes that mindset of, they'll grow out of it, or it will get better. I've had a lot of parents tell me, I was just like that when I was younger and now I'm fine. And in some cases, just kind of based on our interaction, my thought is, okay. And in other cases, my thought is, I don't know that you're as fine as you think you are, right? And that's not
right
on them, but again, it's that self-awareness piece. I will say for myself, I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. My 5-year-old has some quirks, and I call them quirks, right? They're basically what I call quirks, are like symptoms that are going to lead to something in my mind, but as his mother, I can't make that diagnosis. But he's got some quirks. And at this point, I'm still at this level of, I don't know that we need a diagnosis. He is fine and functional. He's starting kindergarten in 2 weeks. So we'll see how it impacts him in the classroom. And then at that point, I can make the determination of whether or not I think that will serve him to have a diagnosis, right? A formal diagnosis. But I don't think he's going to grow out of these things because he got them from me, right? So I've got some quirks as well. And so I think, but that idea of like, they'll be fine. It'll get better. We just need to A, B, or C, right? Beat it out of them, punish them more, give them more consequences, take things away. If you've been doing that and that's not working, that's probably not what they need. It doesn't mean you've been punishing them wrong necessarily. Maybe you need to approach it a different way. And I think, to your point, sometimes it's when you've been doing it for 5, 6, 7 years and you go, maybe I'm not doing it wrong. Maybe they need something else.
Right.
It's hard to do that as a parent.
Right. And then 2, I love it that you're noticing the behaviors, you're paying attention and you're sort of monitoring this and you're positioning yourself that if you need to do more, you're sort of setting the stage he could grow out of those behaviors, but if he doesn't, then I'm prepared to take it to the next level or do the next thing, whatever that thing is.
Well, and for me, I don't think he'll grow out of the behaviors. I think what I want to watch and monitor is how are these behaviors impacting him and how are they impacting his sense of self, right? If you want to jump around very excited and he loves the washing machine, he just likes to see things spin. You want to jump around very excited and you want to do laundry every weekend, that's cool. But if that is causing you to be teased at school and now you're coming home sad and now it's causing symptoms of anxiety and depression, now we have to address it. You know what I mean? So for me, that's where that line is of if that's who you are, be who you are, as long as you can function and be a happy individual. But if it gets to the point where it is causing you anxiety, depression, isolation, withdrawal, and anxiety and depression are another set of comorbidities that go with a lot of diagnoses that children experience. So autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities, ADHD. And so I think it's important we talk about that piece as well. When you're starting to see those symptoms, for me, that is that threshold of, okay, now we got to do something different because how you are naturally is having a negative impact on how you see yourself.
Excellent point, too. And I also want to point out, too, that if we allow these behaviors to go unchecked as when they're children, because we're talking to parents who have adults who are on the spectrum, it gets pretty funky when they're adults because now you're trying to catch up. Now you're trying to get them tested and trying to figure out what to do when these behaviors could have been managed. It's earlier. You serve them well to help them manage the behaviors when they're younger versus trying to get access to services. And because insurance is a whole other topic, they're not going to pay for services to help your adult child on the spectrum manage those behaviors. And you know what I mean? It's like those doors close and they don't open.
For me, I do sometimes, I'm glad you mentioned that, right? I do sometimes have to step back and realize my unique position as a psychologist who is connected to a network of psychologists and a network of speech language pathologists and occupational therapists and physical therapists. These are people I work with every day. And so if my child is 12 and I'm like, oh no, I need him tested and I need to find an SLP and an OT, I can find those people in 3 months or less because I make some phone calls and not because I'm super well known in the field, but literally I have friends I would trust with my children and they have people they would trust with their children. And so I am in a much more privileged position, even as a Black woman, to get my child what he needs at whatever point because I know who to talk to and I have a sense of what he needs. That's different when you're a parent who might be, very financially privileged and intellectually, well off. And maybe you have a multi-million-dollar business. And so you have the funds and the access in that way, but you don't know what to do. You don't know where to start. And so even from that perspective, that person is going to have a harder time. So yes, to your point, early intervention is key. The other piece is the behaviors I'm seeing in my son. Again, I call them quirks. They're subtle things that don't impact him. He is not aggressive to himself or anyone else. And I hate the term aggressive, right? But he does not cause physical injury or harm to himself or anyone else. What I see presents as joyful. Right. So the symptoms I see, the quirks I see are mostly joy. He's got some sensory stuff. He's got some anxiety, but we manage that together. Right. And as he gets older, I'm continuing to watch very closely. I mean, I was also the mom that when he wasn't walking at 18 months, we did physical therapy. And the physical therapist said, he's fine. And I said, let's just keep coming. Right. So early intervention is key. But I would say, for me, I have to sometimes check my privilege, right? So I'm glad you mentioned that and realizing that what I have access to may not be accessible even to the most other privileged, well-off, connected, invested parent.
And thank you for acknowledging that, because you have people from all walks of life who don't have access to those services. And, as I mentioned earlier, particularly for those parents who have adult children on the spectrum and they're trying to find services for their adult children who need ABA therapies. Let's say they are able to get evaluated and tested, and now they need these services and they're shut out. They're not going to be able to get them unless they pay out of pocket. And it is tough to manage the conditions, one, two, to get access to resources and services that they may need. It's a struggle. Yeah.
Well, I think that does take us, though, from this idea of assessments and questionnaires for self-awareness, more to this place of the focus and goal of, this label or diagnosis is really, I need some intervention or treatment that someone's got to pay for. And what does that look like? And I will tell you, anyone who's utilizing insurance is going to need a formal diagnosis.
Great segue into scenario number 2, which is a really great discussion that we're having here. I love it. So parents want to have their adult child formally tested for ASD. So let's say to obtain peace of mind, or they need it due to mandatory documentation purposes for SSI, disability benefits, waiver programs. Dr. Curry, what's the first step towards getting that formal diagnosis?
So I will tell you that, just again, full transparency, that's harder and harder the older your child gets. When your child is in the K through 12 educational system, even at 16, that first step, I would say to a parent, is talk to the school psychologist, do that first step of getting some school-based documentation, try to get an assessment through your school, get some documentation going. So even if they graduate and you apply for SSI, so Social Security, insurance, disability, or things like that, and you're waiting on a formal evaluation from a psychologist, you've got documentation indicating this is something we've been trying to do. It hasn't happened yet, but we're working on it, right? It gives you a little bit of a paper trail. Once your child is out of that K through 12 system, and they haven't been evaluated, it's definitely not the end of the road. But I would say that first step from there is to, if you're utilizing insurance, call your insurance company and say, I'm looking to get an evaluation for my child. We're, suspecting a possible autism spectrum disorder. Who is in network in my area? And then it's a whole part-time, full-time job to call providers, see who's available, see what their fees are. They take insurance, but insurance only covers this much. What are the copays?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. And so I would say that's that first step after you've decided this is what we actually need to do, is to reach out to your insurance companies and call providers. I would say the other step, kind of a 1A or 1B, would be to reach out to friends and family that you're comfortable talking to, who may have either children on the autism spectrum or children who have things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disorders and learning disabilities, anxiety, because those people, not definitively, but likely have had their child evaluated. And hopefully by someone that they had a good experience with, someone they trust. And so I will tell you, I used to take insurance. I don't anymore for a whole host of reasons, which is a whole nother. But I get a lot of clients by word of mouth. They spoke to a parent who had a really good experience. And these are people who are all paying out of pocket. And so talk to people, find out what their experiences were like. Reach out to those providers, even if they don't take your insurance, and just ask questions. Find out, what they recommend, what their wait lists are. It is the wait list for a provider to do a diagnostic evaluation for an adult with concerns for autism spectrum disorders can vary anywhere from 3 months to 3 years.
Wow.
And so, And it's the same for children, honestly. Like that wait list can be highly variable.
Yeah.
And so really, that reaching out to providers and reaching out to friends and family that you trust, I would say is absolutely your first step.
Okay, so they could with their adult child's healthcare provider or mental health care provider?
I mean, so if they're already getting services, if they're already in therapy, or I'm assuming that this is just a parent who has a child who has no services. If they're already in therapy, counseling, seeing a psychiatrist, absolutely reach out to those people and say, hey, I know that we've been doing therapy for 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. I know we're utilizing medication. I know that we're doing parent training to help me, but now I want a more formal diagnosis. Absolutely. Those are going to be point people as well.
Great. Okay.
Because you want to find a provider that you trust. That's the other piece. Again, I'm speaking from a place of access privilege. And so hear what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I tell this to people who call me as well. You need to work with a provider who you connect with / trust. And so if you go with the first provider who has an opening, even if you don't really feel good about how your conversation went, the first time they say something that doesn't match what you see, you're going to discount everything else that they've said about your child. Right. So it's really important that the person you work with, even if the wait list is 2 months longer or 3 months longer, is someone that you trust, someone that took the time to hear you, someone that you feel like you would absolutely trust their word.
Right.
Because this is not like you said, there's no medical test, right? It's not a blood test. And so the provider you work with is going to be doing an evaluation, and they're going to be using valid assessment tools and getting lots of objective data. And yet, autism spectrum disorders, much like attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, right? They're neurodevelopmental, but we assess them by the behaviors that we see. And so if you don't trust the way that I perceive what's happening with your child, you are not going to trust my diagnosis. You're not. And then you wasted time.
You're absolutely right.
6 months, you got this report, you don't believe anything it says, and then you want a second opinion. That's another 6 months to a year and more money. And so it's important to work with someone that you trust. And I'm saying trust, like even that initial, trust your gut.
Right.
Right. If you talk to someone and you're like, oh, I vibe with her or him, right? Okay, cool. Then go with that person. And it might be like you reached out and got connected to the highest person in the field of autism research. Cool, that's great. If you talk to them and you're like, I feel like you're just going to use my kid in your research and you don't really care what's going on with them, but I'm going to do it because your name on their report means something. What happens when that report comes back and it doesn't say autism? Are you going to get a second opinion? Are you going to believe them? Are you going to go back to that thought of, oh, you just wanted them for research and like you don't even remember their name, you don't know what they like. So really go with the person you trust. I think would be my second tip. And think about the goal of the evaluation, right? For you as a parent. For some parents, the goal of the evaluation is, I want to better understand my child, how they function, how they process, so I can best support them. For other parents, sometimes the goal of the evaluation is, I need guardianship. And I need documentation of my child's limitations.
Right.
So that we can obtain legal guardianship of my now 24-year-old child.
That's a big one. I've met so many parents who are in that position right now. It's out of need and dire need, I might add.
And so does that change how you might answer some of these questionnaires that this gives you? Does that change how you might present your child at that initial meeting, right? You have to keep that in mind because it will. If I need to get guardianship of my child, it's going to be harder for me to remember the great things about them in the moment. I need you to understand the hard days because that's what I need documented. And so sometimes the psychologist will push for like, but tell me about a good day, right? And your thought is like, why though? Like, you're not listening. And it's like, I am, but we need to present a balanced picture of your child for people to take this report seriously. And for you to look at it in 5 years and go, oh man, that person hated my kid. No, not at all. Our goal was really based on what information we get from the parents and,
right.
and the assessment measures that we use. And so, once you've done all that, you felt out a person, you've thought about your kind of, I won't say motives, but like goals, intentions, and needs. Then that evaluation process itself, different people do things a little bit differently, and that's fine, right? In the field, you'll see different people doing things a little bit differently. But for the most part, you're going to do a clinical interview of some sort with the psychologist. They will ask lots of questions. They'll interact with your child. And I say your adult child, right? But like your young person.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They will, depending on the independence level, it's hard for me to say functional level because that can mean so many different things. But depending on the independence level in terms of communication and social interactions, they may or may not focus some of that clinical interview to your child as well. And then they're just going to do their assessment. The assessment is conducted without you in the room or in the space. Some parents don't realize that until the moment of, right? Because sometimes as psychologists, it's not something we think about to say, yeah, we're going to do testing and you're not in there. It's like we'll do a clinical interview with you and then you are welcome to stay in the lobby, go shopping, do whatever you need to do. But testing is one-on-one. And so, doing that with the child and then rating scales for parents if the child is engaged in activities. So again, across the levels of independence and functioning, and I use quotes under functioning, a child might be in a day program, or that adult child or that individual might have a full-on job or be in a marriage or a relationship. And so we don't just want to get input from one person. We try to get as many perspectives on those rating scales as possible. So again, that we have a global balanced view of this individual. I have people who reach out to me and say, and I'm making up this specific scenario, right? I'm a 35-year-old woman and friendships have always been hard for me. I'm highly successful. I make plenty of money. I'm married. I'm, considering having children now, but I've always felt like there was something going on. And the more research I've done, I feel like maybe I have an autism spectrum disorder. I would evaluate that person as well. But I would also say to them, so could be an autism spectrum disorder based on what you're describing, could also be anxiety or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Mm-hmm. Are you open to exploring all of those things? And if it's not autism, is that okay with you? Those are questions that I'm going to ask because for some people, they've done so much research for parents, for individuals, that they know that's what it is in their heart of hearts. And if I come back and say, I see what you see, but to me, that doesn't look like autism. It looks like a language disorder with some anxiety and ADHD, then we've got a conflict. Mm-hmm. So I always ask ahead of time, I understand this is what you think is going on, and absolutely that might be it. But my goal in going into an evaluation is not to prove that someone has a specific diagnosis. My goal is to filter through the data to find the best box or boxes, right, that fit this person's, symptoms or symptom profile or presentation.
Right. And I also love how you sort of demystified the evaluation and testing piece there so that parents will have some sort of expectation. Like once they land in, let's say, your office, what happens next? Thanks for explaining that. So I appreciate you doing that. So in terms of levels, it's been a while since my son was diagnosed and we talked about these ASD severity levels. Are providers still using those ASD severity levels or not? or are we diving off into the deep end here?
No. Your listeners may hear a smile in my voice because my initial thought, kind of when we talked about us having this conversation, I wanted to, obviously I have my own opinions, but reach out to other people in the field and say like, hey, what's the deal with levels for you? So I don't use levels like level 1, level 2, level 3, because I feel like they mean different things to different people.
And I just want to say, the reason I asked that question is I've seen, just in me doing some research here, that some people are still using those levels, level 1, 2, and 3 in terms of severity, because when I talk to people, they're like, okay, well, what level is your son on? This is still how they're sort of communicating here. So just on a surface level, maybe explaining, at least minimally, the difference between levels 1, 2, and 3.
So it's kind of as you just mentioned, levels of severity, with level 1 being more mild and level 3 being relatively more severe in terms of functional difficulties. And so I don't use them because, I can say Josh is level 1. And what does that mean? That means that maybe Josh does well in school, academically, and language-wise, he's fine, but has no social skills at all and has no friends and is also depressed and anxious because he's in middle school and everyone hates him. Right? Someone else at level 1 can, to an unknown or unfamiliar person, may seem like absolutely nothing's wrong because they're putting all these things in place to be, I'm using quotes here, more functional or present more neurotypically and less, neurodiverse than maybe their life experience or their true experiences. However, when I reached out to colleagues and just people on some of the listservs of neuropsychologists and testing psychologists that kind of I interact with and consult with from time to time, the responses were varied. I mean, and strong. Absolutely, you have to use levels. It's part of the diagnosis. Right. It is required, and that's what parents need. And other people fell more on where I stand of levels don't give information. And so I tend to use more specific specifiers like with or without language impairment, with or without intellectual impairment, requiring substantial support in, certain areas, things like that. But it was so interesting. And I'm so glad that I just thought, hey, let's just see what people say. Because in my mind, we don't use levels. And the level of intensity at which people were like, absolutely you do. And other people were like, absolutely you don't. Right. Was so interesting. And so I say that to say for a parent, and all professionals, no one is like not licensed or ill-equipped or ill-prepared to work in these populations. And so I would say you're going to get different things from different providers. And it's okay for you as a parent, if you have a level system in mind, to say, I know you didn't note a level in the report, but if you had to give a level, where would it be? Because they still might not land specifically on a number 1, 2, or 3, but that opens the discussion for them to really talk about like where your child falls in relation maybe to other individuals about their age who also have autism spectrum disorders, right? So like all the tests that we give, or most of the tests that we give, are what we call standardized or developed with the idea of neurotypical individuals in mind, right? And so when you provide an evaluation, the kind of general stuff, IQ tests, academic tests, things like that. The autism measures obviously are developed with the idea of assessing an individual for an autism spectrum disorder, but you're comparing them to a neurotypical population, right? You're wanting to see how a neurotypical individual performs on this task. And then you're wanting to see how an individual with an autism spectrum disorder performs. And then when I do an evaluation, I look to see which, in which group this person falls more closely into. And so even if I'm not listing a level on the diagnosis in my report, I can speak to a parent about, Johnny's language skills are a little below average, but where I really saw difficulties were some of those executive functioning skills, some of that rigidity, some of that planning and organization and time management. And that's why he gets so frustrated when you're trying to transition, because you say 5 minutes, he doesn't have a concept of 5 minutes. And so when you come back 10 minutes later and think, I gave him an extra 5 minutes, to him, you might have been gone 10 seconds or 2 hours.
Right.
And so those are the conversations I like to have with parents during that feedback session, is to really talk about their individual child and what that person needs.
Excellent. Wow, this has been a really great discussion around testing, and I think parents are really going to benefit from this too. Just a couple more questions. So in terms of testing and results, once you complete your assessment, how long does it take to get results? Is it something that you're able to measure right after, your assessment and you actually do the testing, or does it take a week, 2 weeks? How long should parents expect to wait?
So that varies a little bit. I will say my typical goal is 3 to 4 weeks, but it's 3 to 4 weeks after I've received everything. And what I mean by that is I'll do the evaluation, and this is my process. I do my evaluation typically over a day or two, face to face with the individual. And then I usually send out my rating scales after. Right? Because I want to make sure that once I've sat down with the individual who's being tested, that I'm sending out rating scales that reflect all the questions I want answered. I used to send them out before, and then I ended up after testing going, oh, that rating scale didn't really look at this aspect. So now I'm sending out 3 and 4 rating scales. And so I'll send them out after, and the faster those come back, the faster I can finish a report. And so for some parents, I'll have to, after a week or a week and a half, I'm just shooting an email like, hey, just wanted to make sure you got the rating scale. Did you have a chance to fill it out? I haven't received the results yet. A lot of them I send out are electronic, so you can do it on their computer and the results come directly to me. And so typically after that, about 4 weeks, some providers who have heavier caseloads do their report writing on weekends or evenings because they're seeing a lot of clients during the day because there's such need. So sometimes their waits for feedbacks and reports can be longer, closer to 6 to 8 weeks. I would say if you're getting upwards of 10 to 12 weeks, then that's problematic. As a parent, as a consumer of these services, you can always reach out via email and just say, hey, just wanted to check in. Is there anything else you need from me? Wanted to check on the status of the report. Even if you couch it with, I'm looking at my work schedule for the next few days or the next month, and I want to know if there's a day I need to take off to come in for the feedback. So can you tell me a sense of what we're looking at timeline-wise? That's absolutely okay to do. And so typically between 4 to 8 weeks, some people will turn it around much quicker. So there are people who can turn a report around in a week because they have larger practices. So they might have practicum students or interns, psychometrists, which are people, a psychometrist is a person whose job is just to do the testing. They're not interpreting the data. They're not doing a clinical interview. They're literally very highly trained on the assessment measures, and they're doing some of those for the psychologists so they can spend their time interpreting the data, getting additional information from families and things of that nature. And so some people you'll see a turnaround time of 1 to 2 weeks, but I think the average is typically closer to 3 to 4 weeks. But again, if you're getting past that 8-week point, then I think you can absolutely, even at 4 weeks, touch base with your provider. This is a partnership. And again, this is why you're going with that individual that your gut told you, I trust them. Because you can trust them to respond appropriately when you say, hey, it's been a few weeks, just want to know what's going on. That their response should be something like, absolutely, here's where we are, here's what we need. It'll be another 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or I broke my big toe last week unexpectedly. I just got home. I promise you're at the top of my queue. Please give me 2 more weeks, right? It's just a conversation. You should never feel bad about wanting to know what's up with your child's results.
Absolutely. Dr. Curry, it has been a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I think you've left parents with many things to consider that's going to be helpful to them. You're listening to the Black Youth Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. I'm your host, Rosalind Martin. I've been speaking with Dr. Toi Curry, clinical neuropsychologist who conducts ASD testing in adults. And Dr. Curry, if someone wanted to reach out to you regarding ASD testing for their adult child, or to schedule an appointment for a consultation with you, how might they contact you?
Absolutely. You can visit my website. It is it's a little long, guys, so bear with me. It's
Take your time.
toicurryscid.com. So TOI as in ice, CURRY as in yellow, and then PSYD. Paul Simon's Yellow Dog. So toicurryscid.com. All my contact information is on that website, my fees, all the services that I provide, my location, and I look forward, hopefully, to speaking to some of you directly.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Curry, for speaking with me here on the Black Youth Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. I appreciate your time. Take care.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much. You have a great day.
You too. This is Rosalind Martin, your host of the Black Youth Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. During this episode, I'll feature a segment titled Driving Us Up the Wall. This segment highlights the wacky, annoying, but endearing behaviors of our adult children on the spectrum. And come on, you know they all have them. These are simply shareable moments to remind you that you're not alone in that the craziness does not just exist only in your household. It is to provide each other with some stress-relieving laughter. This week, a parent will be sharing one of those moments. And remember, we're not laughing at parents and their adult loved ones. We're laughing with them. So stay tuned. It's coming up in just a few moments.
I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend. I don't need that. Got a mean stash. I just changed zip codes for the weekend.
Thank you so much for staying around. This is Rosalind Martin, and I'm your host of the Black Youth Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. As mentioned earlier, joining me is a parent, T. Taylor from California, who will share her wacky, relatable autism moment with us here on the Black Youth Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. Welcome, T. Taylor, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. So, would you please tell us a little bit about your adult son, Ryan, who's on the spectrum, and then share your wacky, relatable autism moment with us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Rosalind. And, you know, as you said, we are not laughing at each other or at anyone. We are laughing with. And
Right.
So my son, Ryan, is the oldest of three, and he is 32 years old. And there's never a dull moment in our lives. Ryan had a shirt and it said, "You'll never figure me out." And oh my God, is that the truth? We try and we think we are in charge and the boss, but Ryan reminds us regularly who's in charge and that you will never figure me out.
I love that.
Yeah, so an interesting story that comes to mind when talking about Ryan is his ability. So Ryan is verbal, but to most people, it would be unintelligible. We understand Ryan because, we've been living with him and in the same household. But, other people would be asking, like, what is he saying? And different things. However, Ryan has the ability to communicate through other means besides just verbal communication. So the story that comes to mind is a friend of mine. We were celebrating her birthday here at our home. And so some friends came over, and this one particular lady or guest whom I had just met for the first time, she talked a whole lot. And, when the party is kind of wrapping up and most people start taking their cue that it's time to go, this lady kept talking and staying around and around, so much so that she ended up spending the night at our house. And so, because it got late and she had driven about an hour. So she spent the night. The next morning, we were going to church. And so instead of her taking her suitcase and taking it to church so she could go on home from there, she said, oh, no, it's okay. I can just come back. Mind you, we didn't want to be talking to her. I didn't even know her. And so not interested in spending more time past the time that we had already spent. But no, you don't want to be rude. So we went to church and we came back. And my son, when we came back from church, my son went upstairs and got the girlfriend's suitcase, who we actually were celebrating. He thought it was the other lady's suitcase. And he got the suitcase, and you just heard bump, 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 bump. He's pulling that suitcase downstairs to give this lady her suitcase, basically telling her without words, it's time for you to go. We've had enough. You talk too much and you don't know how to get the cue and leave on your own. So here, take your ish and go. And it was embarrassing because it wasn't the lady's suitcase. It was the girlfriend who was actually staying in your suitcase. But Ryan didn't care. He was like, you need to go. And so anyhow, it's just one of those things where, that's not the first time he's kicked people out of our house when he's had enough. Basically, it's like, okay, come, feel welcome. You've eaten, you've talked, you've done a lot of things, but now I'm ready to go to bed, or I want my parents to not be down here talking, and I need you to go. So here's your coat, your purse. There were some senior ladies with their cane. He's like, take your cane and your purse and see yourself out. And so kind of one of those things where he may not be able to speak and communicate everything that he's thinking, but he definitely gets the point across. And so, as his shirt said, you'll never figure me out. And it is the truth. Thank you.
T. Taylor, the way I laughed at that story, I'm so happy to have a mute button here because that story is hilarious. I mean, I love that story. I just appreciate you so much again for telling that story.
You're welcome. You really just had to be here. And,
oh my gosh.
There's so many moments and people who have loved ones on the spectrum, a lot of embarrassing moments.
Yes.
That kind of pop up, and you cannot explain some things away. It just has to just go.
Right. And, they're not funny at the time, right? But, we can laugh about them now. The crazy happens in all of our households. Thank you so much for being a guest and for telling that story. We really appreciate you sharing your moment with us, and we wish you and your family all the best. Take care.
Thank you so much.
If you have a driving us off the wall moment you'd like to share, please send an email to Rosalind, that's ROSLAND, at BlackHues, HUES, Society.com. That's Rosalind at blackhuesociety.com and put "up the wall" in the subject line. Share your wacky, relatable autism moment, and it could be selected for an upcoming Driving Us Up the Wall segment. I'm Rosalind Martin, and I've been your host here on the Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast. I hope this episode was both enlightening and uplifting for you. Thanks for listening. Like what you heard? Be sure to subscribe to and download the Black Hue Society Voices Across the Spectrum podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other platforms, and get new episodes as they become available. Tell your family and friends about it too, because I've got another great episode coming up where we as Black parents who have adult children with ASD will connect once again to discuss another meaningful topic. As I wrap up, let's chill out together for just a few minutes more with some music. You see, I believe in music as therapy, as a natural high, and as a salve for the soul. Until the next episode, I wish you love, peace, and positive energy.
Should've never had a 40. I think I ate a little early. Now the colors are floating in space. And now we're talking lighthearted. My mind's all cathartic. I always knew